all 16 teams in the top 29 on strength of schedule. So things are going to be perceived when evaluating the SEC as the schedules are a little bit more difficult. Hello and welcome. It's always college football. I'm your host, Greg McElroy. Today is the August 5th edition of Always College Football. Welcome in from wherever it is you're coming to us from, whether that's here with us via the ESPN YouTube channel. If you're here with us via the podcast, we appreciate you coming in. A lot of new listeners the last couple weeks. I don't know if you missed it. Maybe you watched it. Maybe you're coming to us for the very first time, but Always College Football made its ESPN2 debut last week. Yes, our top 25 show did capture the nation's attention on linear television. We have made it, ladies and gentlemen. We appreciate those of you for your support. We wouldn't be here if not for you. So thanks for all the buildup and the momentum that we've created over the last couple of years together. We're not done, though. A lot to look forward to. And this year, I've noticed with the expanded playoff, a lot of false narratives. But there's one that is legitimately frustrating to me because it's thoughtless. And I'm amazed at how many people will just throw it out there. And I'm sure I've probably done it too. I've been on television and radio and games and all this other stuff for the last 8 months. So yeah, I've probably said it myself. But the more I've started to dive into it with schedules, the less I feel like it's 100% rooted in fact. There's a lot of people that have said, if you're 10-2, you're in the playoff. Like I said, I've been one of them. But not all schedules are created equal. Even within conferences, it used to be like, and I've heard many people say this. I heard a radio show say this last week with a former head football coach in FBS. And he said, yeah, if you're in the SEC or the Big Ten, you're 10-2, you're in. Not so fast, my friend. Partly because some schedules, like, I don't know, Rutgers, are a whole lot different from that of a schedule like, I don't know, Georgia. If you don't believe me, just look at them. Georgia goes on the road to 3 teams that will be ranked in the preseason top 7. Rutgers, if they lost their 2 toughest games, would have their best win against a team that might be bowl eligible. So not all Big Ten SEC schedules are created equal. So let's get rid of the notion that 10-2 guarantees you a spot by going team by team. We're going to go through the schedule, tell you some of the toughest games, tell you what their best wins would look like in the event they lost those games. So that's what we're going to do today. And we will kick things off by looking at some 10-win teams of the years past. Let's look at some teams over the last few years and really just the last few seasons, dating back to, say, I don't know, 2019. Let's just take a couple random years, okay? 2019, let's remove COVID year. Let's look also at 2021, okay? So that way we're a little bit removed from letting 22 and 23 impact our judgment, okay? Because a lot of us are going to generate opinion about this upcoming season based on how that team looked in 23 and how that team looked in 22. So let's just remove ourselves a little bit, okay? In 2019, there were 18 teams that finished with 10 or more wins. 18 teams that finished with 10 or more wins. In 2021, there were 17 teams that finished with 10 plus wins. So we just look at it right there. Those are 2 examples in 2019 and in 2021. You have a combined 35 teams, 18 teams in 2019, 17 teams in 2021. That's a combined 35 teams for 24 playoff spots. There'd be 12 in 2019. There'd be 12 in 2021. So can we cast away the notion that if you are 10-2 or better, you're in? I just gave you an example. There's not enough spots to accommodate all the 10-win teams in the sport. And granted, yes, there are a couple examples of teams in those years that do come from the G5. Like, for instance, in 2019, App State was sitting there 11-1, ranked 21st in the country, and they would technically count as a 10-plus win team. But we know in that scenario, they are not guaranteed a college football playoff spot. Actually, that year, Memphis was ranked even higher than them. They were 17th, and they were 11-1. So looking at all of that, that's just something to consider. So let's go through some teams, okay? Let's go team by team, and let's start in the ACC. We're going to do this for all the Power 4 leagues and tell you some of the playoff contending teams and whether or not their schedule or strength of record, which is basically a fancy way of saying resume, if it would likely be good enough to get in an at-large situation at 10-2. So remember, when you're 10-2, that means you didn't play in the conference championship game. You were sitting there on championship Saturday, twiddling your thumbs and hoping for a chance on selection day, that Sunday morning, for your team to be announced to play in the college football playoff. So we're operating under the assumption that every scenario that we play out right here, the team that we're discussing at that moment did not make their league's conference title. Let's start in the ACC. We did tiers the last couple weeks, so we're not going to go through the 17 teams, okay? We're going to take the teams that I think have a legitimate chance from the ACC to get within striking distance of the college football playoff. So let's start with the Clemson Tigers. I look at their schedule. I think it's extremely difficult, okay? You have a non-conference game against the Georgia Bulldogs in week 1. You go on the road to Florida State. Those are their two toughest games. But in the event in which they lost their two toughest games, Georgia on the non-con at Florida State, they're still in a really good position to get to the college football playoff. Why? Because they're going to have wins against Louisville. They're going to have a win against NC State. They're going to have a win on the road at Virginia Tech, and they're going to have a win against South Carolina. So I think at 10-2, with that schedule, the 26th toughest schedule in the country, Clemson's in. Let's go next to Florida State. Florida State comes into the season with the 31st toughest schedule according to ESPN analytics. They lose 2 of the following 3, because I think there's 3 games on Florida State's schedule that rank above all else as far as difficulty. Okay, one is at Miami. The other is at Notre Dame. And that's going to be a real tough one because it's November 9th, and for all we know, in South Bend, Indiana, maybe it's snowing at that point. Probably not, but possible. And then you have Clemson that comes to you. Okay, you win one of those 3, meaning you lose 2 of the 3. So let's say you lose at Miami, you lose at Notre Dame. Still got to win against Clemson. That's a team that's likely going to be ranked in the top 15 at worst. And then you might still have some other ranked wins at your disposal as well. You're going to have a win against Florida in that scenario. You're going to have a win against Georgia Tech in that scenario. And you're going to have a win on the road at SMU. A lot of people feel pretty good about what the Ponies are going to do this year as well. So I look at Florida State. I think they're in at 10-2 in an at-large situation. Moving on to Miami. Schedule strength for the Hurricanes, not the same as what you're going to get with Clemson and with Florida State. Miami's strength of schedule in the preseason is 54th. So not ideal, but still, if you actually look at how things kind of set up, they could get in. I'll explain here in a minute. Their 2 toughest games are likely Florida State at home, and then they're at Louisville. Okay, 2 very difficult games, no doubt about it. You lose those 2, okay? You lose those 2 because they're the toughest, and we're obviously assuming chalk flies in all these scenarios. You lose those 2. You lose Florida State and at Louisville. Then what's your best win after that if you're Miami? Is it against an 8-4 Virginia Tech team at home? And that's probably a little generous when evaluating what Virginia Tech might be. Is it at Florida in week 1? A lot of people have said maybe Florida. Maybe the wheels come off for Florida. I don't know. I mean, is it at Florida? Is that the next best win? Is it at Cal? Cal might struggle to get to a bowl game. Is it at Georgia Tech, who I think is definitely a bowl team, but maybe 6, 7, possibly, if the stars align, maybe 8 wins. At Cuse, I don't think it's a guarantee for Miami if they go 10-2 and miss the ACC title game. I really don't. Let's go next to Louisville. Now, Louisville, I think their strength of schedule is a little tougher. ESPN does too. At 34, they come in. 34 toughest strength of schedule coming into the season. 2 toughest games, pretty obvious to me. At Notre Dame, at Clemson. Okay, you lose those 2, you still are likely to have wins against a few teams that might be within striking distance of the top 25, but several of which that will likely be in bowl games. Georgia Tech, SMU, Miami, and at Kentucky. But only one of those teams, I think Miami, has a chance to be a legitimate top 15, top 20 team. So you're only going to have one win potentially against a team that is also within striking distance of the college football playoff. So do they get in? I think you might be on the outside looking in if you're Louisville and you end up at 10-2 and lose your 2 biggest opportunities on the road at Notre Dame and on the road at Clemson. And finally, let's talk quickly about NC State. They come in with the 53rd ranked strength of schedule in the ACC. You look at their 2 toughest games, it's pretty obvious. Tennessee in the neutral site, they're in Charlotte in week number 2, and at Clemson. You lose those 2 games, I think it's going to be very difficult for NC State to put together enough strength of resume, if you will, to get back into the top 12 as a possible at-large. At Georgia Tech, at North Carolina, at Cal, you're probably not going to have a win against a team that has more than 8 wins. So none of those 3 teams that I just referenced, those would be the 3 best remaining wins on their schedule. None of those 3 teams are going to probably be in the preseason top 25. None of those 3 teams are likely to be in the top 25 at the end of the season. So if your best win is maybe at North Carolina, is that going to be enough to give you the strength of record to get into the top 12, top 10? Probably not. Not when being measured against other teams from other conferences. So to sum things up in the ACC, I think you have 2 locks at 10-2. That's Clemson and Florida State. They go 10-2, they are in. I think Miami is likely at 10-2 in the college football playoff. I think Louisville is possible, and I think NC State is unlikely. So 2 locks, one that's likely in Miami, one that's possible in Louisville, and one that's unlikely in NC State. Let's move on to the Big Ten. And like I said, there's a big notion that suggests, well, if you're 10-2, you're in coming out of the Big Ten. I don't know if that's necessarily a foregone conclusion. Now, I can point to one example right now and tell you, well, if Rutgers goes 10-2, they're not in. Because if you look at their strength of schedule, they have the 78th ranked strength of schedule right now. Their 3 toughest games are at USC, who was 7-5 last year, and the expectations for this season aren't much higher. At Nebraska, a team that hasn't been to a bowl game, the longest streak right now in the FBS, having not in the Power 5, longest bowl streak in the Power 5. I guess not go to a bowl streak, whatever streak it is. You understand what I'm saying? Nebraska hasn't been to a bowl game in a long time. It's been longer than any other Power 5 program. So that's what I'm trying to say. Problem solved. And then at Virginia Tech. So if those are your 3 toughest games, you lose 2 of the 3. Let's say you lose to SC, you lose to Virginia Tech, and your best wins at what might be a 6-6 Rutgers team, or 6-6 Nebraska team. Rutgers not in. So we can poke a hole in that argument already. 10-2 Big Ten team, not getting in. But let's start at the top. Let's look at Ohio State. Ohio State, 16th ranked strength of schedule in the preseason. Their 2 toughest games are pretty obvious to me. Yes, they're road games. And yes, the defending champion is not one of them. All due respect to Michigan. I think Michigan heading to the horseshoe is more manageable, given what Michigan is bringing back, than having to go to Oregon and to Penn State. I have Oregon ranked ahead of Michigan this year. I have Penn State ahead of Michigan. So I think those 2 games are tougher than the one they'll play in the final game of the regular season. You still have a win against Iowa. You still have a win against Michigan. Even if you lost your 2 toughest games, Oregon and Penn State both on the road, you still have 2 wins against teams that are likely in the top 25. And Michigan might very well be a top 15. In the preseason, probably a top 10. While I don't think their record at the end of the year will reflect that, it's still going to be well respected. I think Ohio State at 10-2 is definitely in, no doubt about it. Let's go to Oregon. Most people have them finishing second in the Big Ten this year. It'd be hard for me to push back. But if you look at their schedule, a 10-2 at-large playoff spot is not a guarantee. It's really not. Their two toughest games are pretty clear. Ohio State coming to them, and then at Michigan. Two toughest games for sure. If they lose those two games, you lose to Ohio State at home, you lose on the road at Michigan, there's no shame in that. There's no shame in that whatsoever. Those are two great programs, two great teams, two Big Ten blue bloods. As you transition to a new league, I don't think most people would be that shocked if Oregon lost both those games. But then you start to look at what might be on the resume beyond those two performances. Those two are losses. Well, what's your best win? Is it at Wisconsin, who's a fringe top 25 team this year? And that's being probably a little generous. Is it Maryland at home? Is it at UCLA? Is it at Oregon State? These are legitimate questions. So that's why I look at Oregon a little differently. I think their schedule's manageable, for sure, relatively speaking, but they're not going to be given the same benefit of the doubt as some of the other teams that will play a tougher schedule in the Big Ten than what the Ducks will play. So if they go and they lose their two toughest and their best win is on the road at 7-5 Wisconsin, will that be enough for Oregon to make the playoff field? I don't think it's a lock. Not at this point. Let's go next to Penn State. Penn State, toughest games in whatever order you want to have it in. Ohio State at home, that's the toughest for sure. And then however you feel about West Virginia, however you feel about USC, those are the three toughest games. You lose two of those three. You still have some quality wins on the resume. You still have a few. You got Washington, you got to win against them, you got to win against Maryland. I mean, these aren't terrible. You're at Wisconsin, so the resume looks a little bit like Oregon. So I don't know if Penn State's a 100% lock, but it's going to be kind of dependent on how good West Virginia is. If West Virginia is in the mix in the Big 12, then that's going to benefit Penn State greatly. What about SC? If SC is maybe better than we anticipate, they beat SC at SC, that will elevate Penn State as well. So I kind of have them in the same boat as I have Oregon. I don't think it's a 100% guarantee that they get in 10-2. I think likely to. Yeah, I think it's likely because of their personnel and because the committee is going off who's best, and I think they'll have a high ceiling, but I don't know if it's a guarantee based on strength of resume and strength of record. Let's go next to Michigan. Michigan, I'll tell you right now, they go 10-2. They are 100% a bona fide lock in the college football playoff. Their schedule is a beast. 18th hardest in the sport. They have three insanely difficult games. Texas in the non-conference. It's at home, but still Texas. Very good program. Oregon, that game is also at home, and they go to Ohio State. You win one of those three and you lose the other two, you probably have a win against a team that's going to be in the top 5, top 8, top 10. So that's a pretty impressive resume booster in and of itself. And you also have a game against USC. You have a road trip to Washington, a team that might be in the top 25. Who knows, at least at that point. So there are some possible feathers in the cap. I think if you get a win against a team that's in the top 10, though, that's really all you might need to garner some attention in the at-large situation when you're sitting there at 10-2. Let's go next to Iowa. Iowa comes in at 44 in strength of schedule in the preseason. I don't think it's a guarantee at this point. In theory, they could have 0 wins against top 25 teams, even if they win 10 games. Their two toughest games are, I think, kind of tough to figure out, to be honest with you. We know a road trip to Columbus is among the most difficult games. We know that. All right, that's one of the two. No question about it. What's the next most difficult game? Is it Nebraska at home? Is it Iowa State in the second week of the season? Is it at Maryland? I don't know what the second most difficult game is, but if they lose one of those aforementioned 3, that's not going to help their resume. So if Iowa's sitting there at 10-2 with a loss to Ohio State and a loss to, say, Maryland on the road, their best win is Nebraska, who might be 6-6, 7-5. Hopefully for Nebraska fans, 8-4. Is that going to be enough to get some at-large attention? I don't think it is. Let's go next to SC. And final team in the Big Ten that we'll do. SC comes in at 27th. I still can't believe this schedule is only 27th. It feels to me like it's more difficult than that. Can't believe there's 26 teams with a tougher schedule than this. I look at it, toughest games, take your pick. You got 4 teams in the top 12. LSU neutral site, at Michigan, Penn State, and Notre Dame. The benefit is that 2 of the 4 are at home, and 1 against LSU is only like 2 hours away in Vegas. That's about it. You get 2 of those 4, you beat Michigan on the road. You beat LSU in week 1. You beat Penn State at home. You get 2 of those 4, and you get a chance for Notre Dame. You lose 2 of those 4, fine, you split them. You're in the playoff. SC at 10-2 is a complete lock. So let's sum up the Big Ten quickly. I think it locks. If they're 10-2, they're guaranteed a playoff spot. Just Ohio State, Michigan, and SC. I think at 10-2, you have 2 teams that are very likely to make the playoff in Penn State and Oregon. And then at 10-2, I think Iowa, even at 10-2, is unlikely to make the college football playoff based on what we think their best win might be in 2024. Moving on to the Big 12 now. And if you look at the Big 12, I'm just going to start by saying this. I'm anticipating carnage in the Big 12. I'm anticipating a lot of parity. I'm anticipating a lot of teams that could cycle up, and anticipating some teams that might disappoint based on preseason expectations. So I look at the Big 12, and I think there's only one team that's going to get in. I can't really imagine here in the preseason that the Big 12 Conference Championship runner-up will make the playoff. And it's also hard for me to envision a scenario in which a team that doesn't make the conference championship from the Big 12 gets in. So this is all hypothetical. Let's start with Utah. Utah, strength of schedule, 72nd. You're kind of understanding why I don't feel like the Big 12 is well positioned to get multiple teams in coming into the year. I do think Utah has a chance to be the best team in the league for sure, but their toughest games will be at Oklahoma State, Arizona, and Iowa State. You lose 2 of those 3 and your best wins, say a 7-5, 8-4 Arizona, that's probably not going to be enough to get you in an at-large situation. Let's go next to Kansas State. Kansas State comes in with the 70th toughest schedule on paper in the preseason. Yeah, you have a tough non-conference game against Tulane on the road, but look at the rest of it. At West Virginia, one of the toughest. Oklahoma State at home, certainly one of the toughest. Those are probably the 2 toughest. You lose those 2, what's the best available for Kansas State? Is it Arizona? They're at home in week 3. Is it Kansas at home in the Sunflower Shootout or Sundown Showdown or whatever we call it? I don't think either one of those 2 wins is going to be enough to bolster the resume of the Kansas State Wildcats. I think if they go 10-2, it's probably not going to be enough. Let's go next to Oklahoma State, the 62nd ranked schedule here in the preseason. You got Arkansas in the non-conference, but Arkansas is not expected to do a whole lot in the SEC. You do have Utah at home, probably the toughest game, and then you're at Kansas State. They're in back-to-back weeks, I might add. So I look at Oklahoma State. If they come out of the gates a little slow like they did last year, and maybe they struggle through the first 5 weeks of the season, you still have opportunities to strengthen things down the stretch, but you're going to be doing so against West Virginia at home. You're going to be doing so against Texas Tech, maybe at Colorado. There's just not enough meat on the bone there to consider them as a possible at-large. Let's go next to Kansas. Kansas is 77th on their preseason strength of schedule. Certainly not a feather in the cap. And remind you, too, Kansas is doing a lot of renovations to their stadium. So they'll be playing in Arrowhead. They'll be playing there at Children's Mercy in Kansas City. So they won't be at home all year. So you look at some of their home games, and they're all, I'm not saying they're neutral sites, but they're not going to have the friendly confines of their home field that they used to their advantage last year against the likes of Oklahoma. You look at their schedule, non-conference against Illinois. Illinois is not expected to do a whole lot. At West Virginia, that could be a really nice feather in the cap, but that could be toughest game on the schedule. You're also at Kansas State. So you lose to Kansas State, you lose to West Virginia. Sure, you get a win against Illinois on the road in the non-con. Is there enough there? Is Iowa State enough to propel you and push you over the top? Is Colorado at home enough to push you over the top in an at-large setting? I don't think it is. Not when being measured against some of the Big Ten teams we've talked about, some of the ACC teams we've talked about. We haven't even talked about the SEC yet. So I have a hard time envisioning a scenario where Kansas could get in at 10-2. And then finally, toughest schedule in the Big 12, according to ESPN Analytics, is West Virginia. And I think West Virginia, they might have a chance at 10-2. They might. Part of that is dependent on them beating Penn State. I think Penn State at home week 1 might be the toughest game on the schedule. They can somehow get that one, and they lose 2 in the Big 12 race. 1, I don't think losing 2 in the Big 12, you're going to have enough to still get to the conference championship game. And 2, look at the teams that you might lose to. You might be on the road at Oklahoma State. Maybe it's on the road at Arizona, which is by far the toughest road trip for the Mountaineers this year. I think it's going to be tough to envision a scenario. Even if you beat Penn State, I don't think it's going to be enough strength on your resume to garner some at-large attention. I think West Virginia's good for sure, but if they're not going to have enough and they have the toughest schedule in the Big 12, it's hard for me to envision anyone in the Big 12 getting in an at-large situation. Basically, what I would advise all Big 12 teams to do, win the conference. And then you're in, you get a bye, you're in great shape. Other than that, I don't think you want to be at the mercy of the committee on selection day next year. Let's go next to the SEC. Just so we're clear, the SEC ranks right now all 16 teams in the top 29 on strength of schedule. So things are going to be perceived when evaluating the SEC as the schedules are a little bit more difficult, but there also are, and credit the SEC in this a little bit, there are some really intriguing non-conference games, mostly against the ACC. Some are at the end of the year. Some are like Tennessee, NC State. Like that's a benefit to both NC State and to Tennessee to have a strong non-conference game like that. Texas goes to Michigan. So there are some non-conference games that the SEC's tried to implement that have benefited their strength of schedule metrics. But I think a lot of it has to do with the perception that the SEC has deeper, more talented teams, therefore making the schedules tougher. So they're getting the benefit of the doubt here in the preseason. We'll see how it all plays out. I don't really care about preseason strength of schedule rankings. I'm just giving that to you as a point of reference. All right. Georgia, we'll start there. Georgia at 10-2 is 100% a bona fide lock. Okay. I think Georgia, and I've said this on this program, I've said it on other programs as well. I think they have the toughest schedule in the sport. At Kentucky, who's a perennial bowl team, top 30 program at worst. At Alabama, one of the best programs in the country, top 5 team in the country coming in. At Ole Miss, top 7 team, top 8 team in the country coming into the season, and a team that has really strengthened these last couple of years as the world has changed around them. You got Tennessee at home, which is extremely difficult, and Texas on the road, which also was a playoff team last year and a top 3 or 4 team in the country coming into the season. So if you can find a more difficult schedule, take the silver britches and the Georgia uniform off and evaluate that collection of players. Just take any players. Just get rid of Georgia altogether. Put Kentucky. Trade schedules, Kentucky and Georgia, and tell me how you evaluate that schedule, because it's a beast. At 10-2, they're in, no doubt about it, because even if they lost to Bama on the road and Texas on the road, you still have a win on the road at Ole Miss. You still have a non-conference victory against Clemson. You still have a win against Tennessee at home. That's enough right there to punch your ticket to the playoffs. So Georgia is 100% in. Let's go next to Texas. Texas, 2 toughest games at Michigan in the non-conference and Georgia at home there in the conference schedule. In the event in which they lose both of those, at Michigan and Georgia, they'd be 10-2 with wins over Oklahoma, at A&M, Florida possibly at home. I think Texas is in because I think Oklahoma's a top 20 team. I think A&M has a chance to be a top 25 team. I think Florida is going to be better than people anticipate. So I think Texas would be in, but I don't know if it's a 100% lock the same way it would be for the Georgia Bulldogs. But let's be real. Texas is going to get in. If they're 10-2, I'd be shocked if they didn't get in. A little bit like the Penn State evaluation earlier. Like Penn State at 10-2 Is it possible they could be left out? Sure. But is it likely? Probably not. I think Texas would be in if they go 10-2. Let's go next to Alabama. Alabama would 100% be in. You look at their schedule: Georgia, Tennessee, at LSU, Missouri, 4 teams that would rank in the top 12. You get a split against those 4 teams. If you beat Georgia at home, you beat Missouri at home, you have a couple losses at LSU, at Tennessee. You got 2 wins over Missouri and Georgia, 2 teams that might be in the top 15. Georgia in the top 5. You're at Wisconsin, a team that might be in the bowl game. You're at Oklahoma, who might be pretty good as well. Alabama at 10-2 is a 100% lock to the college football playoff. Let's go next to the Ole Miss Rebels. Now, a lot of people very bullish on Ole Miss, in part because of the schedule. Let's see how many mulligans they're going to have. Let's look at the toughest games. At LSU and Georgia, I think, are the 2 toughest games in the schedule. I'm not sure. There's a whole lot of arguments to be made on behalf of any of the other games. Like, it depends on how you feel maybe about Florida. You're on the road at Florida on November 23rd. It's a tough game for sure. Florida almost got Missouri last year. Now you got to go there. I think it's a tough game. But you also have Oklahoma, and that's at home. So those are probably the next 2 most difficult games. You lose at LSU. You lose to Georgia. Your best wins against a 7-5, 8-4 Oklahoma team. Is that enough? I don't know. I'm not 100% convinced that Ole Miss is a lock for the playoff if they lose to LSU and Georgia. Because I don't know how good Florida is going to be. I don't know how good Oklahoma is going to be. I think they're going to be fine. I think they'll be solid. Probably in the top 25, maybe in the top 25. Who knows? But I don't know for sure. I don't think Ole Miss is a lock at 10-2. Let's go next to Tennessee. Tennessee, their 2 toughest games are at Georgia and Alabama at them. They lose those 2. I think you still have decent meat on the bone with the win against NC State. I think NC State in record will look pretty good. Now, NC State also not a crazy difficult schedule. So their record might be a little bit better than their ranking from the committee. But still, I think NC State will prop Tennessee up based on where I think NC State's going to end up this year. They're at Oklahoma. It's on the road. Oklahoma, first SEC game. If Tennessee can go on the road and get that one's going to mean an awful lot. And then you got Kentucky at home as well. I think Tennessee at 10-2 is likely to get in the playoff. I don't think it's 100% lock, but I think it's likely that they would get in if they finish the season at 10-2. Let's go next to LSU. LSU, very interesting schedule. I don't think we spent enough time on just how manageable LSU's schedule is. Maybe that's something we kind of visit. But as we dove in, like, their schedule is not terrible. Look at their 2 toughest games. Alabama and Ole Miss both go to Baton Rouge. Then you have some other kind of unique games, but games that should and potentially could be won. At A&M, I think at this point, feel probably a little better about LSU, even though it's on the road. SC in a neutral site, feel better about LSU right now. Oklahoma comes to them in the final game of the regular season. And then you're on the road at Florida. I don't know if there's a ton of meat on the bone beyond Bama and Ole Miss, but I do think collectively wins against those 4 teams would probably be enough to have LSU inside the top 12 as an at-large team in the SEC. Texas A&M is next. You look at their schedule, they lose their 2 toughest games. Their 2 toughest games, I think, bookend the schedule. Notre Dame week 1, Texas in the final week of the regular season. You lose those 2, that means you still have a win against LSU. You still have a win on the road at Florida. Still have a win against a team that's likely to be a preseason top 10 team in Missouri. And you have a win on the road at Auburn, a team that I also think has a chance to be fringe top 25, 8-4 football team thereabouts. I think A&M, even if they lost to Notre Dame in Texas, 100% in the playoff at 10-2. And then finally, we'll get to the last couple here in the SEC, Missouri and Oklahoma. We'll do Missouri. Missouri's 2 toughest games are at Alabama and at A&M. That's it. That's really it. They lose those 2. You got Auburn that comes to them. You got Oklahoma that comes to them, and that's pretty much it. Home games against teams that might be 7-5, 8-4. I don't think it's enough. I think Missouri has to go 11-1 or better, or win the conference, or get to the conference title game to get to the college football playoff, because I don't think they're going to be able to get in. I know they have a really, really favorable opinion of them coming into the season, but the strength of schedule might not hold up. for Missouri. So I think they're far from a lock at 10-2, even though there's a lot of preseason expectations and a lot of preseason praise that's being heaped upon them. And then finally, the last team that we'll do here in the SEC, the Oklahoma Sooners. If they go 10-2, they're a 100% lock. Texas and Alabama, two toughest games. Texas neutral site, Bama comes to them. But even if you don't win those two games, you still go to Ole Miss and get a win. You got Tennessee at your house, get a win. At LSU, get a win. At Missouri, get a win. Oklahoma, I think, has one of the toughest schedules in the country. And therefore, if they're 10-2, they're a 100% lock. So to sum things up in the SEC, the SEC has 5 locks at 10-2 or better, of course. Georgia, Texas, Alabama, Oklahoma, and A&M. Those are the 5 locks. I think they have 3 that are highly likely to get in the event in which they finished 10-2. That would be Tennessee, Ole Miss, and LSU. And then 1 that I think is unlikely to get in, even if they go 10-2, because the schedule just might not hold up, and that's the Missouri Tigers.
Whoa, you forgot about the fly in the ointment here. What about the Irish? What if Notre Dame goes 10-2? Are they in?
I really hope that Irish fans don't hold this against me. I don't think it's a lock. In previous years, I would say no doubt, Notre Dame, great schedule, great team, tons of preseason praise. This year, though, I'm just assuming that they are going to give the benefit of the doubt to teams that lose the conference championship game. So if we're measuring Notre Dame, a team that's 10-2, considering every team that we just assessed in this exercise is 10-2, let's say their 2 toughest games are Florida State at home and on the road at Texas A&M. That means that their best win at that point might be against a top 25 team in Louisville, might be on the road against potentially a top 25 team in SC. Is that enough? Possibly, but I think it's going to depend entirely on how the committee assesses conference championship game runner-ups. Because those teams haven't played extra game against top quality competition. They lose. I still think those teams aren't going to be held accountable the same way they would in previous years. So I think Notre Dame is likely to get in at 10-2, but I do not think at this point it's a 100% bona fide lock.
I just got one scenario I wanted to run by you on that. What if Notre Dame loses at Texas A&M, then runs the table, wins 10 straight, but loses at USC? So they have a great middle of the season and a tough, close loss. Like, does that change things that they beat Florida State at home, or do they have to win at least one of the A&M, Florida State, and USC games to be even considered? Or
I think you have to win. Well, in our scenario, they will win one of those. It just depends on which one's best. It just depends. Is Florida State anywhere near as good as they were last year? If Florida State's a 11-1 football team and their one loss comes to Notre Dame, that's going to prop Notre Dame up big time. If Notre Dame, if Florida State has a tough time filling all those voids on defense, maybe they're not as good. Maybe DJ Uiagalelei struggles a little bit. We fast forward and they're an 8-4 football team. And is that win going to prop up Notre Dame the way it would if they were 11-1 like we just discussed? So I think that's really dependent. I think for Notre Dame, they really need to root for the teams on their schedule. Like I said, them not being in a conference is not ideal for them because they will not have that extra data point, and I think the committee will hold that against them. Either way, they're going to get in. If they're 11-1, they're going to get in if they're 12-0. They won't get a bye, but they'll get in. It's just if they're 10-2 and they just crack the door open for just the tiniest bit of doubt, I could see them rewarding a conference championship loser before they rewarded a team that does not have a massive win on their resume if SC underperforms, if Florida State underperforms, and if A&M underperforms. That'll do it for us. That was a lot of information. I understand that, but it's kind of fun. I mean, I've just heard, I'm not saying it's a lazy take, okay? Because it's not a lazy take. I think it's just been universally accepted by talking heads that if you go 10-2, you're in the playoff. But if you look at history, it's not necessarily a guarantee. You really ultimately need to win your biggest games. But in this exercise, You lost your two biggest games. Everyone we discussed lost their two biggest games. Is there still enough meat on the bone for you to be considered in the event in which you lose your two biggest opportunities? So I thought it was kind of a fun exercise. I hope you guys did too. If you didn't kind of keep up with everything, watch the show again, or maybe we can tweet out some stuff to kind of help you consume the content in a different way, because sometimes I know I struggle when we're going through like all these games and all these names and all these teams and all these scenarios. I know I struggle with it, and I live it like every day. So I can only imagine how difficult it might be to digest. So we'll think of a way for you to consume it. Check out our Instagram and our social media handle at always CFB. And we'll try to kind of compartmentalize it as best we can. So for all of us here at Always College Football, we appreciate you being here. Continue to like, rate, and subscribe to the show wherever you get your show. Just trying to ramp things up. A lot of exciting things coming here on Always College Football, including another edition on ESPN2 a little later in the week. So for all of us here at Always College Football, for Mark, Jake, Jack, the other Jack, I'm Greg. We hope you have an amazing day. And remember, it's always college football. Hey guys, it's Greg McElroy. Thanks for watching Always College Football. Make sure you like, rate, and subscribe to ESPN's YouTube channel and wherever you listen to your podcasts.